Okay, let's try through from the beginning. So helpfully, Michael has sort of set up the background discussion here about the role for education in helping to prevent helping to prevent radicalisation and extremism. And a lot of the focus has been on trying to prevent those individuals from actually becoming radicalised and becoming extremists or terrorists. And this is obviously very, very significant. He set out the context. Certainly there are different policies around the world, but in the UK in 2015, the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act included the prevent duty, which actually holds schools and teachers responsible for protecting pupils from radicalisation and extremism, seeing that educators have a role to play in homeland security. And a lot of the language, as you saw at the start of Michael's presentation there, is focusing on those individuals who might be pulled into the grip of extremism and radicalised. And this is absolutely an important concern to focus on. But my interest is in wider concerns as well, because this isn't the only worry we have. I think that there is some role for education to play in considering the effect on everybody, the general populace, when we hear about and worry about the risks of violent extremism and terror attacks. And that, you know, this is something that, you know, a few people have said in their presentations is such a prevalent concern these days. And what can we do in helping us to maintain a sense of equilibrium and well-being when we're encountering these news stories, particularly when we're online and we're being, you know, bombarded by these sensationalized news headlines? What's a way that we can respond to them that, you know, helps us to live the good life? And I think that an important way educators can support such an aim is by considering the education of the emotions. And again, like Michael said as well, this is just going to be one small approach that I'm going to consider, and hopefully it's accompanied by lots of other things as well. But this will be the focus for my talk today. I'll draw upon Patricia Greenspan's distinction between representational and practical rationality to say that our best response to extremism, and when we're hearing about terrorist attacks or violent extremism, both circumstantially and practically, is to refuse to be terrified. By not being overwhelmed by fear and altering our day-to-day activities, we're going to better support a well-functioning democracy plus our own happiness or flourishing. I also think that this response is going to help to disempower rather than empower extremists. Why isn't that moving forward? My clicking's going backwards. I'm sorry about this. Oh gosh. Okay, I've got it now. It's right-hand sided. It's a European right-hand sided. I'm used to driving on the left. So what I want to say then is that educators have a central role to play in teaching young people to respond to the news of violent extremism and the worry about terrorists and terrorism in ways that support our sense of community and personal well-being. So I'm going to firstly consider the role of fear in this, whether fear is a reasonable or rational response, and under what conditions it is an appropriate response to acts of violent extremism, to hearing about such events, or just knowing that these are possible. I'm going to then consider the educational question about how we can support young people to learn not to be anxious about extremism by learning to manage their emotional responses through a process of rational education of emotions. So how reasonable is it to be fearful in the face of something that is fearsome? You know, we do live in a world in which there exist acts of terror, and these are scary. Nobody wants to, you know, be harmed with, you know, no good reason. So how scared should we be? And just to draw a line around the definition, just to narrow the conversation for a second, I'm taking terrorism here as a violent act or event or the threat of violence against innocent individuals, to incite fear or anxiety among a citizenry, or to coerce a particular response or action from another group of people or another person. And in this way, because these instances of violent extremism, they're usually unpredictable in public spaces, attacking, ordinary people doing everyday things. In this sense, they genuinely are anxiety inducing, in the sense of, that could have been me or someone I care about. And so I'm not going to say that this isn't a real threat. It is a real threat. And just giving the example of the real threat of, ISIS and those claiming allegiance with the Islamic State, Australian political scientist Daniel Baldino says, the lesson here is not to dismiss the IS threat, but to respond in a proportionate, carefully calibrated fashion, to avoid hyping terror risks, and to invest in smart counter-radical campaigns. The building of public resilience, the ability of society to restore calm, and for citizens to adapt rationally to random events and unexpected changes, from terror strikes to shark attacks, remains indispensable. So this idea of building public resilience, even when we know that random violent acts may occur, is vital. Now, if we can't help but be scared in the face of what is fearsome, if fear is also completely irrational, then we don't have much chance of controlling it or our responses to it, let alone in educating young people to do so. Happily, much contemporary psychological and philosophical research on the topic of fear now sees this, like other emotions, as having a rational or a cognitive component that may be deliberated upon and evaluated by the agent as well as others. So fear as emotion, it's going to involve, some kind of sensory perception from which we glean information, an appraisal where we evaluate that information we've received. There are physiological changes that occur, like sweaty hands and increased heart rate. There are conscious feelings, which might be of feeling scared or a desire to avoid something that is scary. The cognitive and attentive processes of what we start paying attention to and what we're focusing on. And this can be accompanied by an action tendency or a motivational component, which could include wanting to run away, for example. There are different kinds of fear, from anxiety to anguish to worry to phobia, but they are related to something that is deemed to be fearsome and that we desire to avoid. Now, fear is very important and reasonable in that it protects us from dangers. It's going to be the thing that stops us from jumping off a cliff because we're scared, and this is a good thing. It can also motivate sympathy for others for whom we feel fear. We might be worried for their safety, and in this sense, it can be a very practical emotion and even a moral emotion. If we're going to, try and help, it might motivate us to help and protect somebody else. But obviously, we can recognise that we can also feel fear towards something we do not actually judge as fearsome. We can have that evaluation of our own response and someone else's. So when it's not warranted, when it doesn't fit, we might say, oh, I'm really terrified of spiders, but that's very silly. It's a silly fear or worry that I have. Maybe if you're in Australia, you can be a little bit more worried about spiders, but generally speaking, we can say, I know they're not going to harm me, but I'm still scared of them, and that's a bit silly. So we evaluate our responses. Drawing on this then, so Nussbaum highlights the rational and irrational or irrational manifestations of fear. And she points out that fear is at once both primitive as well as socialized. And some of the other really interesting examples in the talks that have gone before me today have made some cases for this, where we see fear tied to worries. Rita was talking about Islamophobia being linked to fear. And so they can become part of a culture or a rhetoric. And Nussbaum is very worried about this, particularly as we can see in the sensationalized news headlines and in the media and in the hateful language that comes spewing out. Fear can be manipulated by, for instance, politicians and the media, or certain, actors who want to use it in certain kinds of ways. And they can be manipulated according to certain narratives and stereotypes that are harmful. And according to Nussbaum, this makes fear dangerous and narcissistic. And she says fear is a dimming preoccupation, an intense focus on the self that casts others into darkness. So however valuable and indeed essential it is in a genuinely dangerous world, it is itself one of life's great dangers, because fear can make us think of, the us and the them. And in this polarizing sense, we can sort of create a separation from others who actually are more like us than different. And we create this story, this narrative around that. So acknowledging the physiological underpinnings of fear, there might be physical responses to things that we're scared of that, just happen, but we can also have a cognitive element that then allows us to consider whether that fear is warranted and how we should act on it, even if we've firstly decided, if it's fitting or not fitting, or maybe we just have the reaction. But then we should be able to pause and reflect on whether or not we should think about that concept in this way, or we should act in certain ways based on this kind of a fear. And certainly linking back to the political rhetoric, just one example that we've got is, the Australian federal government in 2010, their counter-terrorism white paper identified Islamist terrorism as the biggest security threat to Australia post 9/11. Yet despite that language, there is little evidence of the threat. And in fact, to this day, not a single person has been killed in a terrorist attack on Australian soil post 9/11. And there was emerging footage a couple of years ago that the current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, back in 2011, when he was a minister, that he suggested to the Conservative Party that they use community concerns over Muslims failing to integrate as a political strategy to win votes, enhancing this fear and, in fact, enhancing this Islamophobia. And so this manipulation of the fear can play into racial profiling, racist political rhetoric, and this is concerning. So let's go back a minute then to Greenspan and the idea of whether or not fear could be representational or a practical emotion in relation to, I want to connect it to the fear of terrorism and violent extremism. So we need to first consider whether the emotional response best represents the situation. Is it fitting? Does it meet that criteria, those conditions, that the object really is something to be feared, and how much we should fear it? And secondly, even if it is a fearful object which we are responding to, how useful is that response? Is it going to be practical? Is it going to help us or others in the situation? And I'm going to argue that our best response, both circumstantially and practically, when we think about the threat of violent extremism or terrorism, is to avoid allowing fear to interfere with our daily lives and our actions, and for worry about terrorists to preoccupy our thoughts. And then I'll make the connection to how we should try and educate children, especially starting with young people, not to feel fear in this way. So the first argument, fear of terrorism as unfitting. So the representational aspect of the emotion in relation to violent extremism, yes, it makes sense to be fearful of unprovoked violence. On the desire model, this means that we don't want to be harmed unexpectedly and undeservedly, and yet it doesn't make sense to live one's life in fear of this occurring. If we think of many other analogous examples, we could be harmed by many things, and it doesn't mean we sort of live our lives worrying about that or avoid things because of it. So we might, be, somewhat likely to be in a car accident or hit by a car, but it doesn't mean we don't drive, or we don't go into the city, or we avoid traffic because we don't want to be harmed by the car. So while terrorist attacks do threaten the safety of individuals and property, again, we're not denying the real threat that exists, especially in open democratic societies. However, there are many more conventional forms of violence that cause much more harm, and even politically motivated and political violence that causes more harm than that of terrorism and violent extremism. What's become the paradigm case, the events of 9/11, remain to this day an extreme and unusual event. It's the only occasion in which more than a few hundred people were killed in a terrorist attack by a non-state actor. And we can contrast that to other sort of things that can harm us. Just for example, globally speaking, 3.9 million people die each year from the flu, whereas those killed by terrorist attacks globally are approximately between 200 and 300 people. So although this is, a scary thing, it is fearsome, it's unlikely. Here's a quote from Michelson that says, "It's important to recognise conventional forms of violence, traditional and civil wars, have almost always been more deadly. The objective significance of terrorism as a threat to safety and individual physical integrity further diminishes when one compares terrorism-related fatalities to fatalities totally unrelated to political or armed violence." And he gives some stats here from the US, saying terrorism poses a far less statistical threat to life than most other activities. 3 times as many people in 2001 in the US died of malnutrition. Almost 40 times as many people died in car accidents during the same year than they did from terrorist attacks. Not to mention the significant number of people who die in the US every year from gun-related violence. Even when we include the 9/11 attacks in the account, the number of Americans killed by international terrorism since the late 1960s is about the same number that of those who have been killed over the same period by severe allergic reaction to peanuts, lightning, or accident-causing deer. And, I don't know about you, but I don't wander around being worried that I'm going to be struck by lightning in a storm. So fear of terrorism and of violent extremism then doesn't seem to be very fitting, but also it doesn't seem to be very useful. So even if the threat is real, we've already argued that it's a relatively minor risk of being caught up in it. And it's not useful or prudent to alter our daily behaviours or attitudes in response to the worry about violent extremism or terrorist attacks. So say we realise that a lot of terrorist attacks take place in big cities or in airports. If we were to stop travelling and stop going into the city or this kind of thing, this is very inconvenient. It denies us pleasure. It interferes with our lives quite significantly in comparison to the percentage of the chance that we would be caught up in some kind of horrible event in these locations. And furthermore, it also sees the terror tactics gaining traction by becoming effective in changing the behaviour and attitudes of everyday folk. If part of the goal of the terrorist is to create a feeling of fear and terror and to alter our daily routines, then it would start to work if we actually did, change our behavioural responses. So what's the practical response? I'm not saying to dismiss the threat, entirely. It's about being aware and not naive. It's not about, just pretending the world is a perfect place. But, so don't deliberately place yourself or others in harm's way. But it's also not about being on permanent high alert where we view all situations and people as suspicious or as potential threats. I think that does so much damage to society by constantly on the lookout for threats in the sense of damaging public trust. We're social relational beings. We need to trust others to just live in the world. There's an importance there of trusting. And going hand in hand back with the political and social rhetoric that is harmful and unuseful, particularly if we're on high alert and this is going to involve, invoking this negative profiling and damaging stereotypes to particular groups of people, then again, that's, creating a very disharmonious society and, you know, not good for anybody. So I then, you know, follow Baldino in saying we need to stay calm and reasonable in the face of the threat of violent extremism. We need to refuse to be terrified, not just because the threat is actually relatively small, but also because the well-functioning democratic society is most resilient when such threats do not prevent ordinary citizens from living their lives, going about their daily routines, ideally without invoking fear-induced harmful stereotypes. Furthermore, as I said, trust is such an important part of having a flourishing life and to, you know, live well in our communities. If we start to exclude people and groups of people, then, you know, not only does that create a less harmonious society, but those who are vulnerable and seeking a sense of belonging are going to be more at risk of seeking that sense of belonging elsewhere, for instance, possibly by joining a group with an extremist ideology. So in my last couple of minutes, I'm just going to connect this to education, and this is brief. There is, you know, a lot more to be said about how this can then happen. The role for educators is multiple, but I think there is an important role for educators in helping, starting with children and young people, for instance, to learn to manage their emotions, including feelings of fear. And this connects to challenging negative stereotypes by promoting friendship, feelings of community in which diverse people can trust one another and feel a sense of belonging. So it's vital that we help students learn how to respond to these worries, these feelings of anxiety and fear. And I think that there's an important connection there in when they're receiving the stories, the narratives, the news stories through the media, particularly online, where they're bombarded with these kinds of messages, how they respond to the feelings of fear that are induced from hearing about the stories through the news and online. One suggestion, very briefly, that I've written about before is that we can perhaps engage students in critical and compassionate engagement with the media. I favour in particular dialogical pedagogy, having the conversations and discussing, you know, the things that we see or come across, the events, the news stories in the classroom, and being able to analyse them in that safe space. And so I think that, you know, students can have this conversation facilitated by their teacher to consider the emotions that are evoked and, you know, what they can do or think about or analyse those emotional responses so that they can put them in perspective and not feel so scared. So in summary then, I think that considering how we can educate people to respond to the news of violent extremism and the worry about terrorists and terrorism in our society is really important to support our sense of community and personal well-being by not being overwhelmed by these emotions of fear in particular, which has been my focus for this talk, by not altering our daily routines due to worry about unpredictable acts of violence. And by doing this, we support the well-functioning democracy and we disempower rather than empower extremists. I think that there's a connection here to the education of critically engaging with that political rhetoric that tries to paint certain narratives, certain pictures and stereotypes, that this way we can sort of deconstruct and disarm those. And you know, in Kassan's new fabulous book, he mentions the idea of counter narratives. And I'm running out of time, so that is certainly, you know, a topic for further exploration. But I think that there's an important role for educators in the classroom to help with this project and with this enterprise.
Thank you very much, Laura. Yeah, Professor Kassan, please.
Thanks, Laura. That was great. I just wanted to ask you about the distinction between warranted and unwarranted fear. So there's one way of thinking about it in which, you know, if someone's worried about swimming, you know, in Australia, you might give them the statistics of shark attacks and say, look, it's very improbable that you'll be attacked by a shark. But I mean, one thing about human beings is that we aren't very convinced by that sort of statistical argument, partly because we realize that we live in an uncertain world where stuff happens where we actually can't meaningfully assign a probability to it. So to give you personal examples, I was in central London on 7/7, a very short distance away from where the bus exploded, right? So in the aftermath of that, I mean, I was somewhat fearful about using public transport in central London. Now, if you'd said to me, look, I'm going to give you the statistics, and the statistics show that you're in much more danger driving on the motorway than you are from a terrorist attack, I think I wouldn't have been moved by that, right? Because of course, the possibility of being blown up on a bus would have been much more salient to me. So I suppose my question is, I mean, is that on your view, is that irrational fear or is it rational fear?
So I think that the sort of any kind of intervention that's needed with adults once we've had these kinds of experiences might take a slightly different form, and it might include, you know, the conversations, and it might include connecting it to a narrative that it is helpful. But, you know, I think that it's not to say it's unreasonable because you've had a traumatic experience, and so it's very natural that then, you know, that's become quite salient to you. Which is why this approach, I think, is going to work better with young people. So again, I'm not sure, you know, when we're talking about maybe young people who've had sort of more traumatic experiences, or maybe in different countries, you know, war-torn countries, they might have to look at, it might have to look quite different again. And so I'm sort of taking for granted, for the most part, you know, a democratic society like UK, Australia, America, where, you know, the threats are real, but we're engaging with young people who, you know, haven't yet had these traumatic experiences, and I wouldn't want them to develop the fears that lead to the kinds of stereotypes and harmful profiling that causes them to be on the lookout for that negative association from the get-go. Whereas I think that's some of the work that the media and the political rhetoric is doing. And so there needs to be something that can challenge that a little bit and try and put it in perspective. Now, if a kid is suddenly, you know, especially in America, if they're suddenly caught up in, you know, a school gun terrorist attack or some kind of horrific account, then of course they're going to be terrified by that and worried by that. There's going to be different response needed, I think, and probably counselling. So I guess I was thinking more of the generic non-traumatized case.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, Professor Kastan. One comment I would like to make, because it refers then to part of my presentation, is the instrumentalization of fear by government or by any other agencies. I think this is an important issue. I think that which I think we can discuss along the way, because it also relates to what Rita Floyd is writing about, is the strategy of securitization. I think these are important, also important issues. I think we can address afterwards. Yeah, it's exactly